Welcome to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, a licensed psychologist and grief specialist, here to help change the conversation about grief and build community and connection while we all adjust to this new normal we are living in. This podcast is for you if you are grieving or if you are supporting someone in a season of grief. I'm glad you're here. Welcome back, everyone. I am really looking forward to today's conversation. Joining us, we have Miriam Cornell, LMFT, based out of Minneapolis. Miriam, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for being part of the podcast. Miriam and I met at APA and just had a good vibe exchange and are excited to do a couple episodes together. So, Miriam, can you introduce yourself and share about your background, particularly experience working with clients navigating the coming out process?
Yeah. So I am Miriam Cornell. I am a licensed therapist in Minnesota. I am a bisexual, non-binary person. I use they, them pronouns, and I work with lots of other people who use various forms of pronouns and are in the coming out process or have moved through the initial phases of that or are contemplating whether or not they want to move in that direction.
What got you into the mental health field?
That came from a lot of my own personal experience in therapy. I was raised in a pretty extreme religious setting. As I was coming out of that, I found my way into therapy, which was one of the best things that ever happened to me, and was able to work through my own stuff in that process of moving through my own deconstruction of religion and healing other parts of myself. I realized that I wanted to work with people like me. And then that turned into working with a lot of various kinds of people. And then eventually my own coming out process. And then eventually finding that people would just show up in my office who had both religious trauma and were queer. They find you, I think most therapists. So yeah, I initially was really focused on maybe doing like cult exiting kind of therapy and realized that's not exactly the most helpful. According to research, more people need the slower paced, over time, gentle working through that stuff. And I found that working with queerness and religious trauma is something that goes together quite often.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to your point, once we start doing our own work, it is like they find us. What usually spurred us to get into this field in the first place, that becomes this common thread in the work we do. I really related to that statement.
Yeah.
So as this is a grief podcast, when we were talking about topics that we could talk through, one of the things that came up was in regard to the coming out process, some of that anticipatory grief piece. How do you as a clinician define anticipatory grief, and how does that show up in that context of coming out?
I don't know if I have a super unique definition, but with clients, I talk a lot about how that anticipatory grief is one of those things where you can imagine all the possible futures and you can imagine all of the ways things are going to go wrong, or all of the losses you're going to end up with, or all the ways you're going to be hurt. And sometimes those are accurate and sometimes they're not. And that doesn't change whether or not we experience that anticipatory grief. So I think a lot of what happens in the coming out process, so my context is coming out later in life. I came out initially as bisexual later in life, and a few years later came out as non-binary. So I have two very distinct coming out experiences. I think coming out as a kid these days can be easier depending on your setting. But I think as you come out as an adult, depending on your context, but there's so much loss in terms of like developmental milestones that you could have had when you're younger. That's one side of it. But then there's also you're an established human in the world with community, with work, probably with people seeing you as a certain kind of person and not knowing what to do with that, or not knowing what they're going to do when you identify yourself as different than they've been experiencing you or seeing you as. And that can be terrifying. Yeah. The risks of coming out are so huge. sometimes, depending on your context, some people lose family, friends, home, work. The list is outrageously long. And those risks have such a huge impact on functioning in life that I think there's a lot of energy spent on that anticipatory grief, imagining how in the world you're going to engage with people or experience life or survive if things go poorly.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And I think about, to use a pop culture reference, like the Inside Out movie, when anxiety pops up with that computer, and it's all of the different ways this could play out, of the future forecasting and the ripples and the fears, and we could end up alone or destitute or all of that. And I think that's such an important piece to consider in that coming out process, and to be coming from that place of, okay, I'm comfortable with who I am, and I'm ready for others to start getting comfortable with who they thought I was, and who I actually am. And,
right.
And we can't predict how they're going to react or respond or relate to us after we open that door.
Exactly.
And there can be a lot of grief and preemptive grief in, okay, this might not go well, like you were saying, and am I ready to grieve that relationship?
Yeah. And I think there's also like anticipatory grief around how I'm going to be existing in the world and how that changes everything around me. It's such a back and forth iterative process. Like you come out and then people change how they interact with you, and then you come out some more and they change how. It's this like constant coming out and re-experiencing people, and people re-experiencing you.
Yeah. That's something that we had talked about in one of our earlier phone calls that I think is such an important piece with coming out, is you're that established whole human. Yes. That's how people perceive you. And in a way, it can be easier to come out in a younger phase of life because it's anticipated that you're going to be messy while you're in those early identity formation pieces. Yes. Whereas coming out later in life, when maybe that's when you finally have the capacity, the space, and the safety to explore those parts of self that were there all along. Yes. There just wasn't permission for that to be out. And so now I'm coming out later. I'm changing these perceptions of me when really I'm still the same. And yet there's not that freedom to be messy in the way that I would have if I'd done this 5, 10, 15 years, 20 years earlier.
Exactly. Yeah. And it can be overwhelming and paralyzing. Yeah.
So with the coming out process, what do you see showing up in your therapy space, the losses that can be part of that coming out?
I think I'm the losses. There's a lot of options. So speaking from like my own experience and from like my professional experience, I think the losses can be family and friends. It can be church communities. It can be any communities. It can be a loss sometimes with coming out, depending on your faith experience. It can be a loss of faith or religion or spirituality, which is also typically a community, not just a belief system. I think sometimes there can be a loss of trust in yourself, or when you realize that you've maybe known all along, and because of the world we live in, because of the culture we live in, because of the context we grew up in or whatever, we get conditioned not to trust ourselves, or we think we are. And I think sometimes it can be heartbreaking to realize that if we had just trusted ourselves, or if we had listened to the little clues, or if we knew that what the little clues were, we maybe could have come out years before, decades before, depending. There's a loss of privilege. There's a lot of privilege in being a heterosexual person, being in a heteronormative couple, being a cis person. And while we don't want to hold on to something because of the privilege, there's a reason why it's easier sometimes to exist in a world where you look to be like everybody else. And that can be that's a huge loss. And then for some people, when you are coming out, you're realizing these things about yourself and you feel invisible to the world. You know it internally. I knew it for a long time before I told a single person. And it had this really invisible feeling, which was really upsetting. I wasn't ready for the next thing. But then you realize that when you do come out, that invisibility doesn't necessarily go away. It comes out in different ways. It's a different kind of invisibility. So you exist in your own internal world and you're invisible. And then you come out, and then a lot of people still don't really see you. They understand the words you told them. I'm a bisexual, non-binary person. They understand those words maybe, but they don't know what that means. And so it's this continued sense of invisibility. But then also for some people, it feels really helpful to just look like everybody else. For example, a lot of trans folks want to pass as a man. They don't want people to see them as a trans man. A lot of people don't want that. That's a very individual process, but that like balance of wanting to pass and not passing, being invisible but not wanting to be invisible, all of these things can be losses in a way that you can't quite explain to someone else who doesn't understand it or isn't like part of the community or hasn't been really close to someone in the community.
I mean, what I'm hearing in that is it's that both and piece, right? There's nothing linear about that process. There is nothing simple about holding those two truths. Like, I want to be seen, and yet, it might be easier or simpler to be passing as not fully seen. And that can feel like I'm losing part of my identity because I'm still not fully seen, fully understood. So even though people are understanding the vernacular, they're not fully seeing me as a human. They're just seeing this label. And that can be disappointing or discouraging. And again, just doubling down on that isolation. Like, I've said this, I've come out, I've shared, I've invited you into connection. And yet, like, you're just seeing the label, and then that's shifting perception, and you're not in it with me. You're not still seeing me. And there's grief there.
There's so much grief there. It's so lonely.
Did that fit?
Yes, absolutely. So I think one of the big losses that people experience, especially later in life, and later in life, not maybe 25 and up. I think until our brains are done developing, until we're out of college, if we do the college thing, I think there's still, like you were saying earlier, like there's a lot of room for messiness in those. Once we're like an adult with an established job and we're supposed to be these like put together professional kind of real adults, there isn't as much messiness. But what people realize is that like when they're 30 years old and they start to have a crush on a coworker or something, or their friend or whatever, and all of a sudden they don't know what to do with it because it's so new. It's so different. And it's real awkward when you're like in 7th grade to have a crush on your friend and then figure out what to do about it. And then middle school is like meant to be weird and awkward and nobody knows what to do with themselves.
And confusing. And
exactly.
And in an ideal situation, we also have supportive adults to help us navigate that.
Yes.
When you're 30 and you have a crush on a coworker, you don't have the same level of supportive adults to help you navigate that.
No, not at all. Not at all. And it can feel so frustrating because it is important to move through developmental cycles. And it's so difficult to move through them when it's not developmentally typical. Yeah. And being an awkward 8th grader at a dance, asking a girl to dance is cute, feels weird, it's different, it's new. But when you're like 30, 35, 40, 50, whatever, and you're doing the really awkward 8th grade thing, because it's like that 8th grade self inside doing the thing as a 40-year-old. And it's really disappointing because you can't get that time back.
Yeah, which I would then imagine feeds back into that loneliness piece.
Absolutely.
Or isolated. Because I want support while I'm trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
And I'm still trying to figure out who are my safe people to help me navigate this while I'm working through that developmental milestone.
Exactly.
In a delayed timeline.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So in a similar vein, can we shift to talking about some of the emotional complexities that might come up as someone prepares to come out? Fears about acceptance or rejection from loved ones.
Yeah. I think the big emotions that I see show up when people are navigating this are fear, confusion, frustration, disappointment, loneliness, shame. Yeah. So I think a lot of times no matter how well surrounded you are by your community or by people that are allies, like I know for myself, I was like, should have been a clue, super ally. The people I live with, my family, are very much allies. And I'm surrounded by allies, surrounded by people that even I have some people in my life that aren't as much on board. Kindest people, never would change how they treated me or anything. But the fear of not knowing what's going to happen and the mistrust I even had in myself as I was figuring it out was really confusing because I knew like my whole life, actually. If I look back, I'm like, oh, that's an interesting little point. Why would you do that thing if you weren't a bisexual person? You probably wouldn't. Once I was really figuring it out, didn't matter how much of an ally I was, didn't matter how much I had let go of all of the beliefs I was raised with about like homosexuality being wrong and that marriage is for a man and woman and sex, all the absurd purity culture rules about sex and stuff. And despite all of the work I had done, I still was afraid to trust myself. And I think a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to figure out whether or not they actually know themselves. Yes. And we end up in those moments, I think, end up with our own internal sense of rejection too. We're anticipating the rejection from outside and then we're creating it for ourselves, which is really hard to manage and hard to know what to do with. And I think, unfortunately, one of the things is that not all of us grew up in spaces where you could figure out your identity, sexuality, your gender identity, anything. And again, back to that developmental thing, I think there can be a lot of anger and frustration around not living in a world where it's just normal to you're at dinner or whatever, and the parents or the caregivers or whoever, the adults in the kids' lives are saying like, oh, any cute people at school, or allowing for gender to mean whatever it means to the kid, what kind of toys they're playing with and what kind of activities they're doing it. So I think it can be really infuriating that you're an adult stuck in this position where something was taken from you. Your identity was taken from you, or your ability and permission to explore it was taken from you. And that can be really hard to manage. I like to think about, it's a pop culture reference. Dan Levy wrote that movie, Happiest Season. It's a Christmas movie, not the greatest movie that's ever been made, but it's a gay Christmas movie, so it's fun. One of the characters in the show is really upset because her girlfriend cannot come out to her parents. And her parents have made it nearly impossible. It's really upsetting. And she's freaking out. What am I doing with this person? Why am I even bothering? And he looks at her and he says, what was it like when you came out? And she's, oh, my parents were so happy for me. And they were like just thrilled and wanted to know all the things or whatever. Super positive experience. And he said, yeah, that was you. And remember when I came out, my dad didn't talk to me for 7 years or something like that. And he says, the thing is that it doesn't matter what your context is. It's that moment before you say the words, before you tell people who you are, the amount of fear and anxiety and terror people have because it doesn't matter who you're talking to. You don't know what's coming next. And once those words are out, they're out. You can't unsay the words. They are not going to unhear them. Yeah. And hopefully most of the time that works out okay. And it doesn't always. And people surprise you in the good ways. Like I talk about this a lot with clients. Like we don't know what the people around you are going to say. And often clients have surprisingly positive experiences with family and friends. And also, unfortunately, sometimes it's surprising in the other direction, or maybe predictable in the other direction. But I think the fear is so powerful in those moments that it keeps people from coming out for years. I think like the shame that people experience around sexuality is really powerful also, because in gender too.
So when you think about the coming out journey, I think we've talked a little around it in this conversation, but that sense of disenfranchisement, can you expand on how that shows up a little bit?
As you're learning about yourself, as you're exploring your own identity, as you're uncovering these parts of yourself that have always been there, you just hadn't found them yet. it feels so clear and so strong, and you can be so passionate about it and excited, and it feels so beautiful to understand yourself more. And you get out into the world and people are like, huh, what do I do with you? And then there can be like I think a lot of gaslighting kinds of behaviors, maybe not intentionally, but, and this especially I think for, I'm gonna say non-binary, but I mean like the non-binary, like not gay or not lesbian or not like trans man, trans woman, like those in between identities can be really difficult. I had a therapist tell me that I didn't need to tell my kids. My own therapist tell me that I didn't need to tell my kids that I was bisexual because they don't need to know about my sex life. First of all, I'm not telling them about my sex life. Bisexuality is just my experience of attraction in the world. And everyone gets to know that if I want them to. That's not inappropriate. And I think there's a lot of like misunderstanding, and it can feel like you're in this other world where they are not going to get you, and they're going to give you advice that's not helpful. They're going to treat you as if whatever is happening or who you are isn't real. And I think it can feel really isolating, and it can be a big deterrent to coming out to more people. Yeah.
Sharing an aspect of your preference and identity, that's not in any way inappropriate.
No. And if I don't tell my kids this thing that's so real about me, that it's just as like important to know as that I have purple hair. Purple hair is like meaningless kind of, but it's like part of who I am, and it's how I express myself in the world, it's how I exist in the world. And if I don't communicate that with my own kids, how are they going to know that they get to communicate that with me or with the world?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that their preference can look different than anybody else's. And because I'm sharing my preference and how I identify attraction, and you're giving them language and space to have, to question and be curious and explore aspects of self that in a home where there's more restriction or less awareness, they wouldn't have that same experience. So why am I going to withhold that from that? That doesn't, there's nothing inappropriate about that.
Yeah. But I think those are the kinds of things that can feel like you don't get to belong in the ways you do actually belong.
This can be really hard and complicated and an arduous process, right? So when we think about taking care of ourselves in that, whether that's self-care, finding safe people to do this with, what would you say are some good strategies for people in that anticipatory grief space, that anticipation of the coming out process?
I think, depending on where you're at in that process, I think finding community is like the overarching, like most important thing, but that can be done in so many different ways. Clients come to me all the time, and one of the ways they realize that they were queer or trans or whatever, they spend a lot of time on social media. And I think this is true for like neurodivergent people too, right? Since in the last few, you like read things, you're like, oh, that sounds like me. Read something else. Oh, that sounds like me. And our algorithms are so set up to feed us what we want or what we're following already or what fits. And so there's something really beautiful, I think, about social media for the people that are especially in that early stage of coming out, and how it can create such a sense of safety and a sense of community. It's that you don't necessarily have to go outside of your home or outside. You can do that on your own in private while you get used to the idea, or you figure out more. I think for me, like early on, I was like, oh my God, I'm a lesbian. I'm going to blow up my whole family. And I love my family. And after a while, I was like, oh no, that's not it. But it had a lot to do with things I was reading, media I was consuming, communities I was engaging with online. It's just such a safe space. I think that's one of the most important forms of self-care that you can do early on. And that could be Reddit, it could be Instagram, whatever. I think therapy, if you can access it, is really beneficial. You just need to make sure that you're finding the affirming therapist. In Minnesota, we have a directory called the Minnesota LGBTQ plus therapist network. And so you just go on there, and it's similar to like Psychology Today, where you select your insurance, you select what kind of therapy you want. You can select if like the gender of the therapist, the sexuality of the therapist. There's so many different ways to sort that search. So finding an affirming therapist is really helpful. Often There's Facebook groups, Reddit groups, whatever, that will talk about which therapists are helpful. And if you have a hard time finding one, sometimes you can reach out to our practice is called Transcend Psychotherapy. It's all trans and or queer therapists. So if you reach out to us and none of us have openings, we're going to send you to some other ones we know. So that's one way to find therapists. But I think for the late bloomers, the late in life coming out people, reading YA novels is a really good form of self-care. Great queer YA. It gives that like 8th grader in you a chance to experience some of those things that you didn't get to experience. And I think because of like difference of figuring out when you're young and figuring out when you're old, it can help you sort it out. I find like TV and movies to be really helpful also because, we get to see, and there's not a lot of great representation, but there's some. And seeing yourself like that can be really affirming, can be really validating, can give you a sense that, okay, there are spaces in the world where I might be welcome. There are people out there like me. I'm not losing my mind. I'm not making this up. It's not a phase. I get to exist exactly how I want to exist. And I think any self-care strategy that includes gentleness with yourself is the key. Like you can use any self-care strategy that you want, if it's walking your dog once a day or whatever, anything you do with holding on to the reminder that you get to be gentle with yourself, that you're in a process, that there is no correct timeline for the process. It's okay to be frustrated in it. It's okay to have disappointment, fear, anticipatory grief about what this process is like. And permission to explore at your own pace. Yeah. Those are my the top self-care things that I like to encourage people to do.
I think those are really helpful in that they're so accessible.
Yeah.
To be able to do. The community piece might be a little challenging, but I think the rest of the things are that's really easy to tap into and access. Mm-hmm. That's helpful.
Yeah.
So in that coming out process, there's the people on the receiving end of the conversation. Mm-hmm. What would you say are some helpful ways for partners and support networks, the people that were receiving that information, mm-hmm. how can we help validate and normalize mm-hmm. individuals sharing that, inviting us into that space?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that can make a huge difference to the people coming out is being the kind of person that's talking about this stuff already. Even if you're a cisgender person, you're a heterosexual person, you do actually have a sexuality and a gender identity. You get to talk about it too. So I think creating spaces where it comes up is really helpful. It's not always a natural thing to do. It can be harder when it's not something that you spend all of your time thinking about. But in order to do that, things that the partners and the family members, the people around you can do are read some books, listen to some podcasts, read the YA novels, watch the shows, ask questions of the person coming out that are about getting to know them, not just to satisfy your own curiosity. If you're having hard feelings, I think there can be some grief on some people's sides because it can change a relationship. It can, maybe parents were expecting to be able to be at their daughter's wedding to the guy, and then there was going to be a bunch of kids, right? So they're going to lose this, not that it's not possible to get married or have kids, it definitely is, but parents are losing something that they didn't realize they were losing. Don't process that loss with your kid. Don't process those harder feelings with the people coming out. Find your spaces. There are lots of communities for those people because unfortunately, no matter what your intentions are, if you are starting to process the harder feelings with the people coming out, they can internalize it as a judgment, as a not being welcome to be themselves, as a not safe space. And that's not what you're trying to do. So find the good spaces for you to do your work, do your own therapy if you need to, find a support group. There's all kinds of spaces. I think using names and pronouns and correcting yourself and really being vigilant and not requiring the person coming out to correct you or to remind you is maybe one of the most important things in terms of the gender coming out process. It's really upsetting and highly intensive emotional labor to have to remind people all the time. And it's exhausting and it makes people give up or let things go more than they want to, or because they feel like they have to. I think it's also super helpful if those people around us can be the people advocating. If you're in a group setting and somebody misgenders your partner or your kid or your friend, you correct them. You be the one doing that work. Give your friend a break. Give your partner a break. Let them just be, and know that you're going to help. You're going to advocate. You're going to remind everyone else in the room that they're a valid human. I think talking to your kids early on, like creating a space where if you are around kids, creating a space where it's okay to say anything about sexual, like you get to be attracted to whoever you are. People always want to be like, oh, you have a boyfriend or girlfriend at school. Maybe we don't actually need to do that. But like creating a space where you're using gender neutral language when you're talking to your kids about who they like at school or things they like to do, activities they want to be participating in, and not using gendered language that's going to shame them or make them feel embarrassed or guilty or confused about the things that they're enjoying or finding interesting. Yeah.
Or wrong. I hear that a lot from some of my clients. I felt like I was doing something or wanting something that was wrong, when really, like, that's just part of who I am. There was a lot of grief around working through that pain of feeling wrong, normalizing the gender neutral language, and just not making assumptions.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
So as we start to wrap up this conversation, what would you say are 2 or 3 key takeaways about that coming out process and the grief that can come with it?
I think this is going to kind of cheesy, but I think it's really important to remember that it is okay that the coming out process includes grief. It's maybe not something we want to have to experience, but it's okay to feel the grief, even though you're doing something that's going to bring you so much joy. The grief is just part of it. I think it's really important to remember that coming out is a lifelong journey, and you will be coming out for the rest of your life in some way or another. And no matter how many times you have to come out, no matter how hard it is every time you have to come out, or some of those times or the spaces you're in, you are absolutely valid. Full stop. And I think with grief and coming out both, there is no right or wrong process, timeline, way to do it. The only thing is you're taking care of yourself in your journey.
So, Miriam, if people are interested in connecting with you, what is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah. I think the easiest way to get in touch with me, I'm just getting my social media up and going, but I have an Instagram, one whole post on it. It's expanding_circles. And I have a link tree on there with email and everything else, working on getting my website going. So that's definitely the easiest way to find me.
Thank you so much for this conversation. And it was really great language and good naming something that is not often talked about, and another piece of normalizing talking about grief and the different ways that it can show up.
Yeah. It was a huge pleasure. I'm so grateful that you had me on to talk about this thing.
And folks, we're going to have Miriam back for another episode in the future, so be sure to stay tuned for that. And I'll be sure to link all of their social media stuff in the show notes so that you can connect with them. And remember to be kind to yourselves today, and you're doing a great job. Take care. That's all for today's episode of Grief is the New Normal. If today's conversation resonated with you, I invite you to share it with someone who might need it. And if you're looking for more support or resources, feel free to head over to The Morning Movement, where we continue to build community and normalize these hard, beautiful parts of life. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, and until next time, be kind to yourself. Opening and closing music is provided by the Datacorns. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, collaboration, or training opportunities, feel free to email me at hello@griefisthenewnormal.com. And podcasts are also now available streaming on YouTube.